Okay, welcome to Psych 236, Developmental Psychology. Today we're moving on to chapter 21. We're going to be talking about adulthood cognitive development. So adulthood, remember we talked about emerging adulthood before, which is ages 18 to 25. This is what we considered real adulthood after 25, okay? And there's a period after this called late adulthood, which is closer to when you're closer to retirement. So this period of adulthood actually spans a couple of decades, okay? Just so you know. So let's talk about adulthood cognitive development. And here's the thing about this chapter. We're mostly going to talk about basically intelligence and abilities, okay? And talk about if they begin to decline during this time or if they stay strong, that kind of stuff. And we mentioned some of these things before because we talked about intelligence before when we were talking about childhood, okay? And some of these things come up again, but now we're going to talk about them during adulthood, and we'll talk about how intelligence and abilities kind of start to change around this time, and they may begin to decline during these decades, or when they decline. Okay, so let's first define intelligence. What is intelligence? Okay, for the most part, it says for most of the 20th century, people believed that there was such a thing as intelligence, that there is such a thing. Intelligence is something that is kind of hard to measure, hard to talk about, right? It's abstract. It's not really a physical thing, but there are people who have studied it. Of course, as we know, some people were believed to be smarter than others because of their higher intelligence level, creating lifelong impact. So yes, there are people who are believed to be smarter than others, and people wonder, well, what is intelligence? How do we measure it, right? One attempt to measure IQ, to measure intelligence is the term IQ. So IQ scores were gathered for children and are generally predictive of education, income, and longevity in later life. So one approach is to basically develop, there were one of the earliest approaches was with Stanford and Binet. They developed the, and I talked about this before, they developed the, the IQ test, and your IQ stands for intelligence quotient, right? And a lot of people have been studied with these tests. They've done a lot of research, and they have found that children with higher IQs usually do better in school, right? Better in education. They usually go on to have better jobs and earn more income, and they usually tend to live longer as well, those with higher IQ scores. And the logic is that if they have a higher IQ, that means that they are more intelligent and therefore make better choices. That's the logic. But does that really mean that IQ measures intelligence? Is it really measuring intelligence, right? We find correlations between IQ and education and income and those kind of things. But correlation isn't causation, right? Remember that? You learned that in Psych 101. Does IQ really measure intelligence? And we talked about that a lot already in a previous lecture. Well, one approach to intelligence, to measuring intelligence, was determined by Spearman. Spearman reasoned that there's something known as general intelligence, okay, and that's abbreviated as G. G stands for general. Spearman reasoned that there is that intelligence is basically one thing, and he called that general intelligence. He said intelligence is one basic trait, one thing that involves all cognitive abilities, that all our abilities can be combined into one trait that we call general intelligence. And people possess this in various amounts, okay? Some people have higher general intelligence than others, okay? It cannot be measured directly, but instead is inferred from various abilities, right? He looked at various abilities, and those various abilities taken together determine your overall intelligence, which he called G. There's brain research that holds promise when it comes to measuring general intelligence to determine that there is such a thing. Turns out that the prefrontal cortex, the very front part of your brain, which is involved with attention, the ability to focus, planning, controlling yourself, the prefrontal cortex might be, an important source of G, or general intelligence, right? Your ability to think and plan and focus and things like that, and that's related to G. Higher activity in the prefrontal cortex, right? When they try to measure general intelligence. There's also a correlation of the midbrain caudate nuclei with adult IQ. Another part of the brain that seems to be correlated with IQ. More activity usually is indicative of higher IQ. Those who score higher have more activity in that part of the brain. So Spearman, the point here is that Spearman argued that intelligence is one thing, and he called that general intelligence, and it's abbreviated as G. Research on age and intelligence. There was cross-sectional research that was done decades ago by the US Army. Now, the US Army basically recruits a bunch of people and they do a bunch of tests. And apparently they also tested people's intelligence. So the US Army tested the aptitude of all literate draftees during World War I. So they tested the abilities of basically those that can read and write who were recruited into the Army during World War I. It was a classic study of about 1,191 individuals, ages 10 to 60, okay, from 19 New England villages. One study focused on just 1,191 people, and they were all from New England. So they didn't test everybody with this study, okay? They didn't look at everybody. And research showed that, there's a lot of young men who were drafted to fight in World War I. And research showed that younger men, right, those that are about 17 or 18, actually did better on these intelligence tests than the ones that were older. Does that mean that younger people are more intelligent, or is there something else going on? Do they have certain advantages over people who are older? We're going to talk about things like that. So this was cross-sectional research. Let me explain that. Cross-sectional research, all it does is compare people of different age. That's all it does. Okay, and it's called cross-sectional. Sounds complicated, but it's not. So they compare people of different age. Then came Bailey and colleagues, and Bailey also studied intelligence in people as they age, but he did what is called longitudinal research. With longitudinal research, they basically test people over time. So for instance, they might test 1,000 people, measure the IQ of 1,000 people on a given year, and then measure their IQ 10 years later, 20 years later, the same people. They try to track down the same people and then give them the IQ test again, or measure their intelligence again. So that's a different kind of research where they track people over time and measure the intelligence of the same people over time. Cross-sectional research, they just compare people of different age. What they found is that there's intellectual gains through adulthood, that people seem to get better and seem to basically get more intelligent as they get older into adulthood. And we know that this makes some sense. Children aren't as smart as adults. They don't score as well on IQ tests as people who are older. So yeah, people do get smarter as they get older. They also found that younger people do better than older people when they compare people. When they compare people, they compare how people do when they're younger and how people did when they're older, right? And they find that when people are younger, they do better. That's called the Flynn effect. Again, is that really due to the fact that maybe younger people are smarter, or is that due to the fact that when you're older, things are different and you have certain disadvantages, right? There's debate about that. Is the environment have something to do with it, right? More education, right? Improved nutrition, smaller family size, fewer infections, right? And not changes in innate intelligence. Bailey reasoned basically that the finding that younger people do better than older people is not because younger people are smarter, it's because younger people have it better. Older people lived in a different world. Guess what? Education has gotten better. And we know more things now. Now we even have the internet, education at our fingertips, right? Nutrition has gotten better. We could argue about that, but we are, as a country, richer now, and there's plenty of food to go around for most people in this country, okay? And it might not always be good food, but decades ago, people were, they might have found it harder to get proper nutrition. The further back you go in time, not just a few decades, but further back in time, the more people struggled, by the way, to feed their families. Nowadays, we live in a land of plenty. There's plenty of food, right? Smaller family size. Families are smaller now, and maybe there's better opportunities for children, right? They get more attention from parents. Maybe, I said better education already. There's fewer infections. Healthcare has improved dramatically, okay? That makes it better for children to learn, and they're more likely to survive as well. So maybe these are the changes that are causing the differences that we see when we compare younger and older people, and not that people have more intelligence, not innate intelligence, not intelligence itself that comes from within. Okay, it's probably not the case that younger people are smarter, or that basically every generation is smarter. That's probably not the case. It's probably more the changes that have happened in our society, especially the amount of information that we have access to nowadays compared to people a long time ago. This is better than cross-sectional research, but also has problems. Longitudinal research is better, right, when you track people over time than just comparing people of different age. Cross-sectional research, all you do is you put people in a room, you give them all an intelligence test. In about an hour, it's done. It takes about an hour. And then you compare people who are younger, the people who are older. That's it. You just compare people of different age. Here, you give them a test, when they're 20 years of age, let's say, you give them the same test when they're 30, when they're 40, when they're 50, and you track them over time. It probably started earlier than 20 years of age, because they found that people get smarter as they get older. That only happens up to like adulthood, okay? It doesn't, after that, it doesn't really happen. It declines. We'll find out in a moment. Let's keep going. There's also cross-sequential research that is even more complicated. That's even better than longitudinal research. Cross-sequential research combines cross-sectional research and longitudinal research. So remember, cross-sectional research is research that just compares people of different age, and longitudinal research tracks people over time. So what you can do is you can have people of different age that you test, and you track these different age groups over time. That's called cross-sequential research. This reduces complications of historical change. Longitudinal research suffers from what we call cohort effects. No, not cohort effects. Longitudinal research suffers from historical change, right? Where things change as people get older, and that can reflect advantages that people can have. But there are also problems with this kind of research. There's the impact of retesting, where people take the same test, when they're young, and then when they're older, 10 years later, 20 years later, and those are called practice effects, okay? People may be doing better because they've seen the test more than once. There's cohort effects that also come into play here, that are a problem for cross-sectional research, okay? And also cross-sequential. Because you're comparing people of different age, well, those people are different cohorts. They're different generations that grew up at different times, and that still reflects advantages that younger people have over older people. Younger people now are growing up with the internet, growing up connected, right? Older people didn't have that. So older people were exposed to less information. More information probably makes you smarter, okay? Other experiences, all that was analyzed. But cross-sectional research is better. You compare people of different age over time, but you still have the problems with people of different age being different generations that had different experiences. One example of this cross-sectional research was the Seattle longitudinal study done by Shea. He started it in 1956, and I guess it ended in 2005, right? Think about that. That's like basically 50 years, just about 50 years. It's cross-sequential, so he compared people of different age and tracked them over time. He looked at 500 adults age 20 to 50, and he tested 5 different mental abilities. He looked at verbal ability, that's to do with language, right? He looked at spatial ability. Spatial ability has to do with your ability to visualize objects in space, right? Basically manipulate objects in your mind, okay? Like to determine, for instance, like when you're trying to imagine how to solve a puzzle, for instance. It's a physical puzzle, but you can imagine it. If I twist it this way or that way, then it does this, right? That's kind of spatial intelligence. He also looked at inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when you reason from specific to general, okay? It's a reasoning test of logic. He looked at number ability, which has to do with math. And he looked at word fluency, which has to do with basically, I guess, how well people read and speak and things like that. And he added a new chord every 7 years. So he started in 1956 and, and tested people. And then 7 years later, he tested those people again and introduced a new group that he tested. Okay. And then 7 years later, he tested those groups again that he already had, and he added another group. That's what he did to to create this cross-sequential study. Findings: he found that people improved in most mental abilities during adulthood and then declined later in life. Yes, we do get smarter as we get older, but only up to a certain point. Yes, children are not as smart as adults, but after a while, we start to decline. Okay, we get less intelligent, or our abilities decline later in life, and we'll talk about when that is. And there's some debate about when that happens. Each ability has a distinct pattern for each gender. So abilities kind of decline at their own rate. So let's look at these graphs so we can understand this a little bit better. So you can see the graphs here. He looked at men and women separately. So men, we have the graph on the left, and women, we have the graph on the right. So the red line there, the red curve represents number ability, the orange one spatial orientation, the blue one, I guess the blue one word fluency, the green one inductive reasoning, and the other one that's kind of purple, verbal meaning. And you can see how abilities kind of increase, but then they kind of, if we look just at men for a moment, right? They kind of at about, 46 years of age, you're about as good as you're going to be. And then they begin to decline after that. Same thing, actually for women, it's a similar pattern, but there's some slight differences. For women, you can see the abilities kind of increase a little bit, and then they level off, but they don't decline until after 60 for most of them. Looks like spatial orientation, the ability to manipulate objects in your mind, right? To visualize object declines a little bit sooner, just like with men. But you can see that abilities decline later in life. As you get older, your brain just isn't going to be as good at figuring things out. Your brain isn't going to be as good at remembering things, as solving problems. And, all that is part of intelligence. So yes, it's just, you're going to decline later in adulthood. When that happens, it depends. And this research, by the way, is kind of biased because, it was done decades ago and it started in the 1950s. And well, a lot has changed since then. If they're starting some of this research now, they might find, some differences. Okay. I will tell you, based on what I know, that a lot of things will impact when you decline. If you stay active longer, for instance, if you continue to work longer, you'll decline later. If you have a job that's more stimulating, you will stay sharper and more intelligent longer than if you have a job where you just kind of do things with your hands. You're not using your brain as much as someone, let's say, who's a mathematician or a lawyer or a doctor or even a professor. Okay. But it also helps to stay physically active. If you stay physically active, that's also good for the brain. It's blood flow, right? Increases blood flow. That will also help you to stay sharper longer. So there can be individual variation depending on what you're doing. Let's talk about other aspects of intelligence, components of intelligence. According to Cattell there, Cattell says there's two clusters of intelligence. There's actually two types of intelligence according to Cattell. So this is a different approach, different theory that says that intelligence is actually two things. And then we'll look at how that varies over time. Cattell says that there's two types of intelligence: fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is basically basic intelligence that makes learning of all sorts of things quick and thorough. That doesn't say much, but fluid intelligence involves working memory, abstract thought, speed of thinking. Let me explain this. Fluid intelligence is basically what we really think of as intelligence, your ability to figure things out, to solve problems. That's what we're thinking about. It's when you, if you think about people trying to think and figure something out, if you can imagine and visualize in your mind the little gears turning in their head as they're trying to figure things out, right? As their brain is working, that is fluid intelligence. It's just the ability to figure things out, the ability to be quick on your feet, to think about abstract things, to think about ideas and reason and use logic. That's fluid intelligence. That might be a little bit hard to understand, but it's easier to understand when you think about crystallized intelligence, because crystallized intelligence is different. Crystallized intelligence refers to things that you've memorized, things that you've learned, that you've memorized. It reflects accumulated learning. vocabulary, and general information. So the more you read, books or whatever it is, the more you learn, the more things you memorize, right? The more things stick, right? That's crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, think of it more like memory. The more things you have in memory, the higher your crystallized intelligence. So one is your ability to think and figure things out. That's fluid intelligence. The other one is crystallized intelligence, which just refers to things that you've learned, things that you've memorized. And how does this change over time? Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. Think before acting. Both of these adults here, and you see these two images here, they're doing a certain job. Looks like someone is trying to, the person on the left, that woman on the left is trying to read an x-ray, of something there. And the woman on the right looks like she's some kind of architect or something like that. Both of these adults need to combine fluid and crystallized intelligence. The point is that most jobs actually and activities require both. The ability for you to think and figure things out, but they also require for you to have some knowledge of the things that you're working on. So they require both fluid and crystallized intelligence, right? They require insight and intuition. They require logic and experience. So the point is that most things that you do, most activities require both the ability to think and figure things out, and they also require for you to remember what certain things are and what they look like. That's crystallized intelligence. So the total picture of intellectual ability, how does this vary as we get older? So it turns out that fluid intelligence decreases with age. Our ability to think quickly, to figure things out, to use logic, reasoning, that decreases with age. Your brain, right, is fully developed when you're about 19, early 20s. And that's when biologically, you're kind of at your best. You kind of have peaked biologically, okay? That doesn't mean you can't get smarter, but your brain at that point is fully developed. It's going to work as well as it works, okay? Crystallized intelligence, and by the way, your brain will decline as you get older. Your intelligence will start to suffer. Your ability to think quickly and remember things and to think more intelligent, it will decline. Crystallized intelligence increases with age. The longer you live, the more you read, the more knowledge you accumulate, right? The more crystallized intelligence increases. So crystallized intelligence won't really decrease until your brain actually starts to, really decline and you start, getting dementia or Alzheimer's, right? But crystallized intelligence, right? Just the more things you read, the more you go to school, the more experiences you have, the more things you learn, right? So crystallized intelligence actually increases. Speed decreases with age, right? Your ability to, to figure things out quickly, that reflects fluid intelligence. And verbal ability increases. Verbal ability, right? The words that you know actually increases, with your lifespan, right? As you get older and you learn more things. So IQ scores fall only after substantial declines in fluid intelligence affect crystallized intelligence. So your IQ, if you think about intelligence as IQ, your IQ declines only after your brain is so impaired that it starts to affect your memory. Because at the beginning, there's declines in fluid intelligence, but crystallized intelligence makes up for that. Like for instance, myself, I'm in my 40s, okay? My fluid intelligence is not as good as it used to be when I was in my early 20s. I was probably better back then at figuring things out and probably faster at thinking than I am now. But I know a lot more now. I have read a lot more things. I have a long education that I've had, right? And because of that, I don't seem like I'm less intelligent. I might even be more intelligent. I know more stuff, okay? I can probably figure out more things and solve more problems. It's just that I'm not going to be as fast as I would have been when I was younger. But when I was younger, I didn't have all the knowledge I have now. You see how that works, right? One declines, the other one increases. And so intelligence remains relatively stable, according to this, until late adulthood, when your brain really begins to suffer. And then Sternberg, we've mentioned Sternberg before. Sternberg said that there's three kinds of intelligence. Analytic intelligence, which we talked about before. We probably didn't call it analytic intelligence. I might have referred to it as academic intelligence, but analytic intelligence is valuable in high school and college. It basically, we're talking about that kind of intelligence that's measured on tests in school, right? And on IQ tests, that's analytic intelligence. So it's valuable in high school and college. as students are expected to remember and analyze various ideas. That's analytic intelligence. It's basically also called book smarts. But there's also creative intelligence. It allows people to find a better match to their skills, values, or desires. Creative intelligence, well, it allows people to be creative, to find other ways of doing things, other ways of approaching things. Creative people are the ones who basically come up with unique solutions, or the ones who tend to be more artists, artists and musicians, and just people who do things differently. They're unique, they're more creative. That's creative intelligence. And then there's practical intelligence, which is also called tacit intelligence. Practical intelligence is basically using intelligence in the real world. Practical intelligence is useful as people get older, right? Because as you get older, you have to solve lots of problems. You have to raise a family, right? You have to maintain a household. And you also have to, do things at work. You have to be practical in how you do things, okay? Some people run a business, or just managing your marriage, managing your life. All that involves practical intelligence. So practical intelligence is also important. And only one of these, by the way, is actually valued in school, and that's analytic intelligence. The only one that's measured on your traditional IQ test, traditional intelligence tests. These three intelligence in adulthood, right? Here's the thing, cognitive tests of adulthood require less analytic or creative intelligence. The things that you do when you're older don't really require, the things that you do when you're an adult doesn't really require a lot of creative intelligence, and not a lot of cognitive or not a lot of analytic stuff as well. See, you learn a lot of stuff in school, a lot of stuff that's in books. But what's more important when you're an adult is practical intelligence, how to actually manage your life, okay? It's not going to help you too much to remember, let's say, the quadratic formula that you learned in math. Probably has no relevance to your life, but that would be analytic intelligence. Practical intelligence is more important in managing your life. Most adults need practical intelligence, right? It's the most useful of the three. You can be really smart at school, right? You can be a total nerd, but that doesn't mean you know how to manage your life, okay? But you're really good at books, right? And understanding what's in books. But practical intelligence requires also flexibility. You have to be flexible and try, different approaches. It cannot be assessed by an abstract test. These intelligence tests that I usually don't look at practical intelligence. Practical intelligence is what you do in the real world, and that is not what the tests ask about. That's not what is tested. If you want to know whether people are practical, if they have a lot of practical intelligence, you have to give them something to do in the real world, not some test on a piece of paper. Age and culture matter, and they affect intelligence. The value each kind of intelligence, the value of each kind of intelligence depends on age, and it depends on culture. Different cultures value different kinds of intelligence, and we value certain kinds of intelligence differently as we age. Like analytic intelligence is valued in high school and college when you're younger because you're dealing with school. But those with analytic intelligence can also seem absent-minded as they're thinking about these things, right? As they're reading, as they're trying to solve those math problems, you can seem absent-minded. Creative intelligence is valued when new challenges arise, and more in some political systems than others. Creative intelligence is valued when you have to try different approaches, when you have certain challenges. You have to, sometimes be creative. Like for instance, let's say that money's tight, okay? Let's say your spouse lost their job. Now you got to make it on one income. You have to find a way to be creative to make ends meet. You also have to be practical and make ends meet, but sometimes you can be creative in how you can save money, or how you can, like for instance, combine certain things, certain costs or something like that. You can be creative in different ways. Okay, and in some political systems, yes, in some political systems, creativity is more important than others. If we have democracy, if we have freedom and things like that, then people can be more creative to create the kind of music and writing and art that they want to. If you live in a restricted political environment where you have a dictator that tells you what to think and you're not allowed to, to do whatever you want, then that tends to restrict people. They restrict free speech and freedom of expression, and therefore people there cannot be as creative. Practical intelligence is valued more during adulthood, like I said, right? It's useful in every society, but could be used for good as well as evil. Practical intelligence can be good and also bad. The things that that people do. Even criminals have practical intelligence. They have to find a way, let's say, to break out of prison, or find a way to make ends meet, and maybe they don't have a job. So they have to be practical, and some of them are practical in how they choose to steal, right? Or how they choose to, illegally obtain certain things. It can be used for good as well as evil. A fourth factor, wisdom, that we haven't talked about, helps people judge which intelligence to use and how to do so. As you get older and you have more experience, you should develop something known as wisdom, which allows you to apply intelligence, in a better way. Certain situations call for one type of intelligence over another, and people who are wise just know which approach to take, when these different things arise. I feel like I'm going too slow. Selective gains and losses. So, people do decline as they get older. They gain on some things, they lose on others. And a very important thing that has to do with that are stressors, stress in general. Stress is internal, something we feel inside, right? Type of anxiety, a type of fear. Stress is an internal thing. Stressors are external. Stressors are the things in our environment that cause the stress. It could be your job, your marriage, the kids, right? All sorts of things. So a stressor is an experience, a circumstance, or a condition that affects a person. Harmful choices will increase stress if you make bad choices as far as how to spend your money, or basically whether to go to college or not. If you go to college and you do well, you're likely to have, better circumstances later on. And you might increase your stress when you go to college, but then when you're done and you have a good job, you'll probably have less stress than if you don't go to college and then you get a job that doesn't pay you very well. Okay, that really limits your choices. Stressors can also cause illness. Okay, when the body is stressed, right, it's just more prone to illness and disease. The immune system is weakened when you are stressed out. Harmful choices, yes, can cause illness and disease as well, right? Drinking too much, right? Doing drugs, not eating right, not exercising right. Those are harmful choices. Stressful personal events are actually more common, right? Where people experience stress on a personal level, okay? Minor stresses are called hassles, by the way, minor stressors, like everyday things that we have to do, like getting to work on time, okay? Feeding our kids, for instance, okay? Making sure the kids are bathed, making sure the kids are dressed to go to school, okay? Things like that, minor things that we do every day. They're not that stressful. They're called hassles, but they build up over time. It's not that stressful to take your kid to school once and deal with all the traffic and be in a rush, but to do it every day is very annoying and stressful. Globalization and high-speed communication, high-speed internet, networks, right? They facilitate stress by allowing us to watch disasters and experience stress from afar, right? Because we have the internet and because of globalization and we know what's going on around the world with the news and everything, we get stressed out about more things now. We hear about problems happening in some country, how there was a natural disaster and people died, and how we should help and contribute, or about, whatever it is, something happening even in another state, another part of the country. We have so much access to information that we worry now about a lot of things that we didn't worry about before because we didn't have access to that information. And by the way, now we're always connected. We're always exposed to information, and that is kind of stressful. Just for instance, knowing who won a certain election in a certain country or your country is stressful. If you're aware of that and you're rooting for one candidate over another and it's close, and that is stressful. If you didn't know, right, and you just had to just rely on what people told you afterward, then it wouldn't be as stressful. But the fact that we can keep track of that stuff makes it more stressful. We are more connected. We have more access to information, and information is stressful. Worrying about a lot of things. How do we cope with these stressors, right? How do we cope with this, this stress? Well, there's several coping methods. Okay. Stress correlates with and causes illness. I said that already. Stress weakens your immune system, increases certain stress hormones, which can actually damage you physically, okay? And will just make you more vulnerable to disease and illness, if it progresses. So stress also undercuts thinking, reduces future mental ability. When you're very stressed out, it's harder to focus, okay? It's harder for you to remember things. So it harms your ability to do well in school, and will therefore harm your future ability, okay? It also affects logic, increases logic. It makes it harder to think intelligently, right? To reason. It increases depression when you're stressed out. If you're very depressed, you can also, if you're very stressed out, you can also get depressed. And it can, cause other psychological illnesses like anxiety, for instance, and obsessive compulsive disorder. All sorts of things are related to stress and anxiety. There are gender differences, and there's different coping methods. There's problem-focused coping and there's emotion-focused coping. And research shows that males use more problem-focused coping. When it comes to stress, males experience more an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity. The fight or flight response basically responds, and testosterone levels rise in males when they are stressed out. They are more problem-focused. They're more likely to deal with the things in the immediate situation. I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. Females are more emotion-focused. What happens to them during stress is that oxytocin rises. And oxytocin is a hormone that causes people to bond with each other. So when females experience stress, they're more likely to basically want to talk to their friends. And, this tend and befriend thing, they're more likely to want to huddle closer together and talk to each other. Whereas men is like, oh, I have a problem, I need to do something about it. Men are more problem-focused coping. Women are more emotion-focused coping. The gender differences are not exaggerated. Both men and women use problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. It's just that men, basically, a higher percentage of them are more problem-focused, and women, a higher percentage of them are more emotion-focused. But the differences are not that large, okay? We use both. But men favor one a little bit more than the other, and women favor the other one. Let's talk a little bit more about these coping methods. There's different coping methods. There is avoidant coping, problem-focused coping, and emotion-focused coping. Avoidant coping is not very healthy. That's when you ignore, you forget, or you hide the stressor. With avoidant coping, basically you ignore the problem. You avoid the problem. You ignore the problem. Let's say you have a paper that you have to write that's coming up, and you just ignore it, and you put it off, and you procrastinate. You ignore it, okay? Or you forget because you don't want to think about it. You basically are hiding the stressor. You're not thinking about it, you're denying it, and in that way, it keeps down your level of stress by ignoring the situation. That's not very healthy. Or maybe you have problems in your marriage, and rather than working on the problem, you pretend like there's nothing wrong, or you walk away. That's avoidant coping. I do that. I have problems with my wife, and sometimes we argue, and sometimes I just walk away. I don't want to deal with it. Okay, that's avoidant coping. There's also problem-focused coping, which is a little bit more healthy. Problem-focused coping is when you tackle a stressful situation directly. So let's say you have a paper that's coming up that you need to write. So if you're going to use problem-focused coping, you're going to go and look at the syllabus. Okay, what do I have to do? All right, let me start working on this. Let me start looking up some sources. Let me start doing some writing. Work on the problem. Start dealing with it, right? Or if you're going to be problem-focused, use problem-focused coping when it comes to your marriage. All right, we have a problem. We don't get along. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about our marriage and talk about what the problems are and what's causing it and see if we can work this out. But there's also emotion-focused coping. With emotion-focused coping, you change your feelings about the stressor rather than changing the stressor itself. Emotion-focused coping involves changing your feelings. So if you're stressed out about a paper, you can decide, for instance, that you're gonna just drink some alcohol to relax you, or you're gonna smoke some weed, or you can do something healthy, or you can decide, like what I do, to go on a jog, and that reduces your stress. That changes your feelings. You work off that negative energy, and you feel better afterward. You're not really solving the problem. You're not really ignoring it, but you're making yourself feel better. That's emotion-focused coping. You do something to make yourself feel better. Or maybe you call your friends up and you talk to them. Or you decide to go out and party, or you decide to eat something, to listen to music. All that is about changing your emotions. Those are the coping methods. Let's keep going. Let's talk now about expert cognition. We're still talking about abilities here. And some people seem to be experts. It seems like it's a little bit misaligned here. We probably should have talked about stress and coping at the end, because expert cognition, expertise, seems to have more to do with ability and intelligence, which we should have followed that up with this, right? So, but we need to talk about expertise. Okay, what is expertise? Expertise are specialized skills and knowledge developed around a particular activity or area of a special interest. Okay, let me explain that. Expertise just means you're really good at something. Okay, you're really good at solving a certain kind of problem. You have a lot of knowledge. You're good at it. Like maybe you're an expert in math, so you're really good at math. Okay, or you're an expert in psychology, or maybe you're an expert in plumbing. You have that specialized skill and you have a lot of knowledge about that. That's expertise. And research shows that there's 4 aspects when it comes to expert thought. When it comes to being an expert, there's 4 things that matter. One is intuitive thought, or your intuition, automatic thought, automatic thinking, right? Strategic thought, the use of strategies, and how flexible you are in your thinking. Those 4 things matter. And let's talk about those. Let's talk about intuitive thought first. So experts rely a lot on their past experience and immediate context, right? Their actions are more intuitive and less stereotypical. So experts usually have more experience. And because of their experience, they can use their intuition a bit more and kind of, they have more of a hunch or a gut feeling as to how to solve a certain problem because they have more experience. People who are new, who don't have a lot of experience, they are more stereotypical. They tend to follow the rules more. Well, I learned that you should do this first and that first, and let me work on it that way, right? That's what new people do. That's what novices do. They're not experts, so they stick to the book more. Experts who have been around a long time, have been working on something for a long time, have more experience, so they can be a bit more intuitive. You can say maybe a bit more creative about how they solve a problem. So experts are more intuitive. That's the point. Automatic thought also matters. Automatic processing. Experts, their thinking is more automatic. So thinking without deliberate conscious thought, right? That's automatic processing. When you can basically think more easily about stuff, okay? When thinking is more automatic, it comes more easily. Experts process tasks more automatically, saving conscious thought from familiar challenges. So experts, because they've been around for a long time, they have more experience, they've dealt with certain problems before, they are able to figure things out faster. They think more quickly, okay? Their thinking is more automatic. And because of that, they still have mental capacity left over. They still have attention and thought left over for other things that may come up, a surprise that may come up. So let's say they have to fix a plumbing problem, right? They will be able to figure out the problem more quickly. And if there is something that comes up that they didn't expect, well, they can figure that out more easily too, because they still have mental capacity left over for that. I'll give you an example. I hired a plumber, some months ago to fix, certain lights that weren't working. And I knew it wasn't the light bulb. The light bulbs weren't burned out. The lights just, didn't work in some parts of the house. So I called up this electrician, someone who I've worked with before, who's older, and I consider more of an expert. And he came in and he knew what to do right away. It was a problem. Certain things aren't working, certain things are. And right away, he kind of figured things out. And he checked this, he checked that. And before you knew it, he was done. He'd say, okay, what else you got? Well, I got this. All right. Well, and then he fixed that. And then what else? What else? In like an hour, he had fixed a bunch of problems. And though he charged more per hour, I saved money by hiring him because he solved a bunch of problems like in an hour. And yes, it's about $100 an hour to pay these experts. I could have hired somebody, that's cheaper, right? For maybe $50 an hour, who's not an expert, but would have come here and probably taken all day to fix the problem. And it probably would have been more expensive. Experts are more intuitive. Their thoughts are more automatic. They're faster at thinking and figuring things out. Experts are also more strategic. Experts have more and better strategies, especially when problems are unexpected. So experts just use better strategies. They have more experience, and they have other ways of solving problems that new people do not know about. Experts are also more flexible. Experts are creative and curious, right? They deliberately experiment and enjoy the challenge when things do not go according to plan. So experts are more likely to try different things, more curious, and they experiment. They'll try different things. They're more flexible. All that, according to research, right? Intuitive thought, automatic thought, strategic thought, flexible thinking, all that is what distinguishes experts from people who are not experts. And a lot of people, and just to caution you guys, a lot of people would call themselves experts. A lot of people call themselves professionals, right? But very few people are. I wouldn't say very few people are professional. A lot of people are professional, but very few people are actually experts. When you hire someone who's really an expert, you're going to know it. They're going to do really good work, and you know, they do a better job, and they solve it better. They do it more quickly. They know what they're doing, but they're also charged more per hour. But it could actually be better for you if you hire these people than people who take a long time. Expertise, age, and experience also matter. Expertise, age, and experience are essential requirements just for expertise, right? People who are experts usually are older, they've been around longer, they have more experience, okay? Circumstances, training, talent, ability, practice, all that will affect expertise, right? Having the right circumstances, the right training, right? Going to the right schools, having the right teachers, right? If you have the right ones, then you're going to learn better. You're more likely to be an expert than if you have crappy teachers, or if you don't go to a good school. No matter, it doesn't have to be about, an academic field, but it could also be about plumbing or being a mechanic or something like that. Do you have good teachers? Do you have the right training? If you do, you're more likely to become an expert. And also the ability. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are just better at solving problems than others. Having the right practice. And of course, age is important, right? Your experts will usually be older. I'm not saying they'll always be old. They're not always senior citizens. But usually to be an expert, you need 10, 20 years or something on the job, depending on the kind of job, okay? Expertise sometimes overcomes the effects of age. Yes, there are people who are older, who may work slower, right? Physically work slower, but because they're experts, they're better at figuring things out. They may be able to figure out certain problems that the other person cannot figure out. Even though they can work faster, they can't figure it out. Maybe the expert can, even though he'll probably get there more slowly. Because maybe their brains are declining. Now, here's the thing about experts. They're not always the oldest people. The oldest people usually have more knowledge, but, you don't have to be really old to be an expert, okay? Like for instance, as far as, being a professor, age would matter a lot. The longer you've been teaching, the longer you've been doing research, the longer you've been a professor, probably the better you are. But if you are so old already that you can't think very well and that your brain doesn't work very well, your memory is suffering, then you might as well retire, right? Because yeah, you're an expert, but the fact that your brain is declining is actually reducing that. So you're not as good as you used to be. Usually you're pretty damn good when you're in your 40s. If you've been at the same job in your 50s, you're still pretty sharp. After that, you can still be good, but abilities do decline, when you're like around a senior citizen. And that's sometimes what, they'll see certain billboards where they'll show us, like I saw a billboard for the University of Antelope Valley. It's just a trade school, by the way. It's not a real university, okay? It's a trade school where you learn, I don't know what kind of classes they take there, but cooking classes or plumbing or stuff. It's a trade thing. And they have I've seen that billboard where they have the really old guy who kind of looks like Freud, professor with a beard. He looks like he's 80 something years old. That wouldn't be my best choice for learning from an expert, okay? Sure, he might be good, but he's probably on the decline already. Experienced adults often use selective optimization with compensation. Those people who are experienced, who are older, their memory might be a little bit worse. They might have lack certain things, right? Because they're older, but they can make up for them because of their increased knowledge, right? Or because of their expertise, because they've been working at it for a long time. Let's keep going. Let's talk about family skills. Okay, two recent occupational shifts. So more women are working jobs now that traditionally were reserved for men. There were certain jobs in the past that, men did more often, and now more women are going into. Um, like being a professor, or being, even, or being in healthcare has always attracted a lot of women, but more women are also becoming doctors. More women are going to graduate school, and women's work has gained new respect. So more women are working now than before, and they're taking jobs that traditionally were done with men. You find women everywhere now. Some jobs still mostly men, but women there's more women working now. That's the point. Okay, and even in jobs that were traditionally male jobs. Experience and maturation increase the likelihood of family expertise. So here's the thing. You also develop skills and expertise raising children, raising a family, just dealing with the everyday challenges, right, of raising those kids, right, managing them, making sure they don't turn into monsters, or that they don't drive you nuts, or make you go broke, or whatever it is, because they're wasteful or something like that. Managing your marriage, managing your household, all that, right, are family skills. And you get better at it as you get older. When you're a new parent or you're new to your relationship, you're not as skilled as when you're going to get older and you've had more experience. Okay. Responding effectively to emotional complexities and unanticipated family changes, right? You learn about that as you get older, as you gain more experience and you mature a bit. You are better at responding to the changing challenges, right? And the emotional complexities that come up, right? The conflicts in the family between mother and child, between mother and father, and or the two children, right? All these are complexities, and you get better at handling those things, handling people's emotions, handling the relationships better. Those are all things that increase with time. Expect a woman. Okay, this is the last slide. This is just a slide that tells us that the number of females basically entering medical school has been increasing. And the number of males entering medical school has been decreasing. So now we're very close to 50-50 as far as medical school. So here's the thing. This is the trend I need to tell you about. More women now are going to college. More women are going to graduate school than men. And what's happening is that we're in the past where you had more male lawyers, more males in the healthcare system, or in all kinds of jobs. You're finding that women now are earning the vast majorities of degrees. This is validated by research. Women are earning the vast majority of 4-year degrees and graduate degrees. And it's only a matter of time before we have more women lawyers, more women doctors, more women professors. That is what is happening. Women are going to college and graduate school at much higher rates than men, and less men are going to college. That's what's happening. I don't know what's happening with men, while less of them are going to college, but women are taking more advantages of opportunities than men. Even at the community college, close to 60%, like 58, 59% are women, and only 40-something% are males. Women are getting ahead more than men. And you're going to have trends reverse in the future, where you're going to have more women with higher incomes than men, and the wage gap will probably disappear. Okay, and you're going to have more highly educated men, more highly educated women than men. And I have a lot of women in my psychology classes. Psychology attracts a lot of women, and I'm telling you this, and because you should expect this. Some of you are, going to have, or a lot of you are going to have college degrees, but some of you are going to have to settle for a husband without a college degree, and that's just the way it is, because there's more women getting college degrees now than men. And that's what's going to happen. Some of you are going to be the higher earners and the more educated in your household. Okay, as women is what I'm saying. That's what's happening. That's the trend. That is where I'll stop. So let me stop recording.